This is The Baseline, discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. Welcome, everybody. You're tuned to The Baseline. Callie Warren Shaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA, and we are nearing that final stretch of regular season NBA basketball. Handful of games remaining and a lot of scenarios left to be played out. And if you're someone who had an opportunity to check out our previous episode where we had the great Coach David Thorpe on board to discuss, the landscape of why this is considered one of the more exciting times of following the NBA and the playoff chase, the run for a championship, because it's so wide open. Well, we're going to continue the momentum of that conversation in this week's episode. And as always, man, I can't wait. I'm always, shivering in anticipation to be able to get my mans on www.shawsports.net, Big Kahuna PNC, my partner in crime, Mr. Warren Shaw, repping out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. What's good, Mr. Shaw? How are you doing this week?
No complaints, man. I've been burning the midnight oil, doing a couple of other things, even outside of the basketball realm, but excited to be here. As you alluded to, this stretch run is going to be wild, and we're going to do something we like to do here when it comes down to the last 15 games, make a little predictions, so forth and so forth, but some dope spirited conversation, especially off the heels of our great convo, as you alluded to, with Coach David Thorpe last week.
Yeah, man. He really highlighted, a lot of aspects of things that I think tend to get missed when we're talking about how you're properly evaluating teams and whether or not they are built for sustainability now at the most critical stretch or the critical junction of this NBA season. I mean, this is what we're talking about now. Most of the really good teams have already kind of, evaluated, have sketched out what the possible outcomes are going to be like. And some of these teams that you're going to find that we're going to have some conversations are in a completely unique space. And the question I think is going to become, do you position yourself knowing that you're gearing up for an extended postseason run? And if so, do you start thinking about resting quality players? Do you start thinking about adjusting your strategy, making in-game adjustments against certain teams in competition, knowing that you're probably going to run into them if you wind up getting matched up based on where they're positioned in the playoffs? So there's a lot of intriguing things, but I think the whole point of the conversation from last week and having Coach Thorpe on board, Shaw, is that we just can't look at it just from the numbers and the records. You also have to look at it from an X's and O's perspective. And based on what he's seeing, he can basically outline. And this is why I'm so eager. And it was just great for him to offer the idea about having him on board when we get to start talking playoff basketball. He's going to really dig in and look at all the video that's going to kind of give us an even more deeper idea of how realistic some of these teams are in their ability to try to make a championship run.
Yeah, one of the great things about, I think, that conversation was just even like litigating it some is just understanding the importance of health and coaching, and some of that I think has started to rear its ugly head. It was a rough week, I think, in the NBA. I don't believe it was maybe Tuesday night or something like that too, where Ingram and Doncic and like everybody, all these people went down with injuries, and some of them a little less severe than others. But at the end of the day, has the coaching and has the player development in terms of the rest and giving people, again, the appropriate time for their bodies to heal as the stretch run comes into play. Has all those things been taking place? And again, some of these things, like anybody can slip on and turn their ankle at any point. We understand that, but some of these other things might be speaking to larger initiatives. And Coach Thorpe talked a little bit about that on the last episode, and especially as much as we talked about Phoenix on the last episode, and they have something major that happened to them, obviously, as well too, that we'll get to. So this stretch run is going to be a lot about the totality of team basketball and who's ready to step up here now with some guys on the mend.
And this is also a great opportunity for us to keep a watch on guys that I think coaches are going to be leaning on to be their X factor / go-to players should situations arise where their star players wind up going down to injury. And you're going to probably hear some names being thrown out there. I know you, Shaw, keep track on them, but they're going to be names that are going to be thrown out there for people to keep an eye on. Like, this could very well be their MVP run, so to speak, of seeing possible extended minutes going into the postseason, whether or not coaches are going to lean towards an extended lineup, more than like a 7-8 man lineup for the playoffs. There's some teams we can clearly tell they can go 10, 11 deep, but there's some coaches that are just very stuck in their ways and know that they're going to probably only go 8, maybe 9 deep and try to ride it out for as long as they could possibly can. So it's just awesome to find out that we're in a space where so many different storylines can be played out. And a lot of it is going to be predicated on where most of these teams are going to situate themselves. So as always, man, be sure to get my man Shaw at Shaw Sports NBA. Get at me again, famously. The show's Twitter handle at NBA Baseline, available on all the major platforms. You know where to find us. To catch this episode and our previous episodes, be sure to check us out at www.thebaselinenba.com. And for those of you who are catching us on YouTube, hello. Be sure to also check us out on 19 Media Group. 19 Media Group, we running these content streets. So if you see the nice blue logo with the awesome number with lettering behind it, that's the 19 Media Group family. Go to www.19mediagroup.com to catch our show and a plethora of other great shows that cover the gambit of what you like to hear. All right, y'all, let's get right into the news and notes. And then, we'll obviously talk a little bit about what our predictions are going to be as far as playing goes. That'll be our subject for the breakdown. But obviously, the big topic of conversation that's already taken place this week is regarding the injury that Kevin Durant sustained during warmups. Apparently, he aggravated his right ankle, I believe it is. And in doing so, he's going to be reevaluated in about 3 weeks. So obviously, we're sitting here saying, hey, the Phoenix Suns look like the kind of team where if Kevin Durant gets himself comfortable playing next to Booker, next to Paul, next to Ayton, we very well could be having a conversation about them being, the top dog, so to speak. But, to your point last week, Coach Thorpe's point, I don't know why people are sleeping on the Denver Nuggets. And I think a lot of it has always been what my contention is that if the Phoenix Suns are expected to be that team, they're going to need it more on the defensive side of the ball. And here is a perfect example of why it's great to have an elite player like Kevin Durant, but it's also great to remember what got you here, what's gotten your claim to fame over the last few years. It's the fact that they play both sides of the basketball, and they're going to need to lean on that again until Kevin Durant is fully healthy and ready to roll. And that's going to be around playoff time.
Yeah, freak accident, unfortunately for KD. Home debut that it was supposed to be for the Phoenix Suns, and now the Suns kind of go back to business as usual when it comes to as it relates to this season, knowing that they have to integrate him back at some point. But is DeAndre Ayton now ready to just like, all right, well, I thought my role was going to be this year, was close down the stretch, and now it's actually got to be this, and Josh Okogie and Wainwright and all those guys, even Landry Shamet can get back, from his injury. This Phoenix Suns team, I think, again, has been played the majority of the season without KD, so there shouldn't be too much of an issue adjusting to roles. But as they were starting to gain a little bit of momentum and maybe even eyeing making a run at that 3 seed and maybe an outside chance at that 2 and 3 are very, very closely together, that might be a little bit more problematic now, with the Durant injury. And now you're just more or less trying to make sure that you can stay the course for the regular season, hold on to that 4 seed, which will give you home court advantage, at least in that first round, and see where things lay after that. But I'm not too concerned about role definement in the short term. And something that you were talking about, as we're leading into this, all teams, Phoenix or otherwise, need to now understand is like, all right, well, how important is the seed for you? So whereas I think in other years, you might see that 10, 12 man rotation, so to speak, to even give some guys some more rest. But now it's like an extended playoff run just because you're trying to jockey for those seedings. So you may have to lean on your horses a little bit more than you'd even like to, with the exception of Denver, seems to be sitting pretty comfortably in the West. Everybody else is kind of bunched together one way or another. So it'll be interesting to see how all coaches play their rotations out. Do they continue to have expanded, or do they kind of tighten it almost into that playoff mode right now because they want to secure a better seed? And I think Phoenix is definitely going to be one of those teams to keep an eye on. But I do believe they have some depth, especially with Terrence Ross off of from the buyout market. And, guys like that can continue to help, but there's no elixir like KD out there in the NBA.
Absolutely. So the topic of our show is going to be more focused on the play-in. So I think this is a great opportunity for us to maybe focus a little bit more on the top end And so my concentration is to what you were saying a little bit earlier before, Shaw, about where the Phoenix Suns sit. So currently, right now, they sit in the 4th seed. They're about 3.5 games out of trying to position themselves to either usurp Memphis and Sacramento, who are respectively jockeying for that 2nd seed position. And to your point, the Denver Nuggets are comfortable at the number 1 spot. Last night was a pivotal turning point in my perception about what it's going to take for Phoenix to, I guess, so to speak, feel comfortable in their skin. The Golden State Warriors managed to beat the Milwaukee Bucks, and now they sit about a game and a half behind the Phoenix Suns in that 4th seed. The Los Angeles Clippers are hot right now. Okay. And I mean, we can sit here and talk about the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Dallas Mavericks, but I'm just more so talking about this in the context of, if you're the Phoenix Suns, Shaw, how aggressive are you really trying to be in elevating yourself to possibly that 3-2 seed, so to speak, right? To the detriment that if you don't pay attention, you might actually drop down to the 6th seed, because the Warriors and the Clippers are likely to smell blood in the water. And if there's an opportunity over the next couple of weeks with the handful of games that are presented to them, that they could figure out a way to jump the Phoenix Suns, and again, I'm not saying they're pulling their punches. I'm just saying I just found it interesting that it could have been a one-way race, so to speak, if it's just the Clippers chasing them had the Warriors lost. But the Warriors now, by doing what they've done, they've inserted themselves into the chat, so to speak, and are now pushing the wave upward to force the Phoenix Suns to get as many wins as possible if they're trying to protect that 4 seed, and or if they're trying to get themselves out of that. Because I'm sure the interesting aspect to this would be, do you really want to see the Phoenix Suns take on, say, the Golden State Warriors in a game in a round 1 situation or something like that? Like, it's just interesting to me how this is all played out just within the last 48 hours.
Yeah, and I don't know that they're in the position to, try to line themselves up, against a certain team, so to speak. I think you just try to accumulate as many wins as you possibly can, and then you get KD back, and then you roll the balls out and see where it goes. I think a lot of Western teams, I shouldn't say a lot, but there could be some Western teams that be looking at Sacramento and like, all right, it might not be so bad for the 6th seed or for the 7th seed, depending on where they land, because Sacramento obviously doesn't have, the playoff experience. I think that could be a mistake. I think when you try to just line yourself up against that way, you give that team that extra
blade in there. So I like that. You just slid that real.
I'm just saying, it's like you're giving that team some extra motivation, and I understand that Sacramento is probably going to be the most picked against seed in this playoffs whenever they come around, no matter where they land. But at the end of the day, I think because of what they have offensively, especially with Mike Brown, the kind of the runaway coach of the year candidate here. Again, I just think it'd be a mistake to try to line up against them, so to speak. But if it happens, it happens. And again, you see where it goes. Phoenix itself right now is just in a situation where, hey, let's maintain some level of status quo. So if you can stay in that 4 or 5 range, whatever that looks like, you just don't want to be falling into 6, because if you fall into 6, that means you're probably falling into 7, 8. Just the way things are bunched up, and anything can go wrong when it comes to those types of situations. So you can play above 500 basketball here, as in these last 15, 17 games or whatever it is for them. I think they'll be okay, assuming Durant can come back, and be the Durant we see even in the short time that he was a Phoenix Sun.
Well, it's interesting how you brought up the Sacramento Kings in this, so to speak, because if I'm the Sacramento Kings, my mind, I just don't want to be backdooring my way into, wherever it is that I'm being seated, or wherever my team eventually winds up being into the playoffs. Like, I just want to make sure that my team is still clicking on all cylinders, that what got us here is still what's consistently being displayed, no matter who we're playing, the final stretch of games going in. I think that will stave off a little bit of that quote unquote paper champion perception, so to speak, of being a higher seed, but no one buying into it. Right. That to me is the one thing. But it's interesting because I think you can almost equate the same thing with the Phoenix Suns. The Phoenix Suns, to me, I think want to be best positioned that even when you get Kevin Durant, we're not second guessing the level of talent that this team can exhibit and can inflict on whoever the opposition is. I think that's the reason why for Phoenix, it's also important that they find a way to play a level of consistent basketball that doesn't have us looking at, well, man, if they don't get Kevin Durant at a certain time, then, we don't know what the Phoenix Suns basketball team is going to really look like, even when they do have him, right? Like, this is about the good an opportunity, one last final opportunity for Monty Williams to get his players to step up and start creating an identity for themselves. Because the outside conversation, Sean, and I know we got a couple of things to talk about, but the outside conversation I really think that is going to start to happen is, hey, you're Phoenix. You couldn't get it done when you had Booker, Paul, and Ayton. You got to go out and get you a KD. And at the end of the day, KD can be as great as he is, but this team still doesn't win. Do you think that that's a stain on KD? Nope. Because that's the Phoenix Suns rolling the dice saying we need a KD on our roster to make this happen, to see this through. Now, I'm just saying, it's going to speak a lot more to Devin Booker and to DeAndre Ayton and to Monty Williams if these guys don't get it together, so that when KD comes in, all you're doing is you're just adding salt to the wounded animal, so to speak, so the rest can eat. You get what I'm saying? That to me is what I want to see happen. If you're a Phoenix Suns fan, I'm sorry, that's what you want to see happen.
I mean, well, without the risk of turning us to the Phoenix Suns podcast, because we've talked about them extensively or in the last couple of weeks, they do have the second toughest schedule remaining in the NBA as we record.
Exactly.
And then even their quote unquote easy opponents are all playoff contenders, if you will. So 2 versus the Lakers, 1 versus Utah, 2 versus OKC. And Orlando is out of it in the East, so to speak, but not necessarily numerically. But Orlando's also given some teams some fits as well too, especially with their size. So they only have one cupcake team.
They are an impressive out. They are an impressive out.
Yeah, they only have one cupcake team, if you
will,
on their
like
roster on their season.
Games. Yeah, they're going to exceed like 30-something games this year. For a team which we all probably said, even if they got Banchero, we didn't know whether or not. I think you rested on the idea that Isaac was supposed, if he comes back, this team may look marketably better or whatever. They've been a surprisingly competitive basketball team, and I think if you're an Orlando Magic fan, you should feel hopeful that that they're starting to put something together that resembles a team that's going to compete in the next couple of years. So we'll see what they do.
Yeah. So Phoenix, only the Spurs are like, hey, there should be no doubt a win. Everything else is going to be tough for them. So hopefully, again, they're able to right the or maintain the ship, if you will, at least stay at the 4th seed and see if things go after that.
All right. You're tuned to The Baseline. Callie Warrenshaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA as we keep things moving along. Out in Chicago, the news about Lonzo Ball doesn't sound like good news. And if you are the Chicago Bulls faithful, it sounds even worse because, yet again, you have a star player who's probably, not going to see the basketball court for the remainder of the season. This season essentially is almost becoming a wash for the Chicago Bulls. But I think the bigger picture is, this is now going to be the 3rd surgery for Lonzo Ball on the same leg, same issue. And it sucks because what I've been seeing so far on most of the threads is, maybe, Lonzo should consider, walking away from the game. This is probably a sign that he might need to retire. And I hate those type of conversations. I think only the player knows, himself and, the people that he relies upon to give him the proper advice of whether or not, the sustainability of him playing in any kind of NBA related career is foreseeable at this point. But if you're the Chicago Bulls, man, this really has to suck because you rolled the dice on really what looked promising and having that trifecta of LaVine, DeRozan, and Ball. And at no point has any 3 of these guys been on the court sustainably long enough for us to really see the fruits that bore labor of these moves that have been made.
Yeah, so he's out. He's already been ruled out. He was ruled out a while ago for the remainder of the season. And it's just now that they're reporting that it could require another surgery, which could mean another 6 months, which will probably obviously bleed into next year as well too, right around training camp or beginning of the season. And then, whatever ramp up period is necessary. He's got 2 years left on that deal. one of them being a player option in 24, 25. I don't know, what the future holds for him. And don't know what his mental state is. You can only hope that it's positive. Even a couple of weeks ago, you just mentioned Jonathan Isaac. He went down again. I think with abdominal injury now, so at least not the same situation, but something else to recover from. And then just the mental aspect. We had our Guy Street close on here some months ago talking about what it means and just the rigorous mental fatigue that comes with having to come back and come back and come back. And look what we just talked about with Kevin Durant. Sometimes he's done that and climbed the mountaintop. Excuse me, to be at the highest level, in this game. Lonzo is not necessarily that, but he is still, a more than productive, NBA player in the time that we've seen him. 25 years old. You just hope that he can, pick himself up by that proverbial bootstraps and get back in here now. And we don't want to speak anything negative onto him in any capacity here on the baseline. So, hopefully, again, the rehab goes well if the surgery is actually required, and that the Bulls get their point guard back in some capacity. But the business of the NBA is always going to be the business of the league. And you don't know if they now have that dissonance. It's like, listen, it's just not a fit because of all the various injuries. If they decide to move on from him, whatever the case may be, we'll see what ends up happening. But we're definitely wishing Lonzo, the best in the speed of recovery.
Absolutely. It just sucks, man. It just really sucks, because when we were watching the first iteration of that tandem of Ball, DeRozan, and Levine, it's interesting. It was Levine who we worried about a lot more than we did about Lonzo Ball. You never had to worry about DeMar DeRozan. I mean, the guy is freaking like an Iron Man for the most part, but he obviously is the eldest of those three, right? So you figure at some point DeRozan is going to break down, and he's probably going to sustain some kind of extended injury with the way that he plays the game. But Ball, man, we saw it, in glimpses in New Orleans, but to the extent that it's happening here, it's not so much the number of injuries, Shaw, it's the extent of the injuries that is keeping him away from playing. And I just can't see how this is sustainable for the Chicago Bulls to properly, put together a roster that's going to compete in the conference not just the conference, in the division, in the division that they're in. You know what I mean? Like, look at the Detroit Pistons, look at the Cleveland Cavaliers, look at the Indiana Pacers, look at the Milwaukee Bucks. There is no sleep on their rosters, right? Like, you can't take a breath without recognizing that they're going to be in it for the next few years. And you need bodies, you need physical bodies, you need talented bodies out there on the court. And it's a tough decision if you're the Chicago Bulls to keep trying to see if this is going to work. You remember we brought this up a little bit with regards to the Portland Trailblazers, right? I think everybody wanted to see that trifecta of Lillard, McCollum, and Nurkic. And my biggest issue was Nurkic was just not available enough, and at some point, if you're the Trailblazers, do you continue to keep trying to push this idea that if he comes back, we'll be as competitive as everyone else in the Western Conference? And you can see what that basically led to. It led to the dismantlement of the potential of a team that probably could have been going to Western Conference Finals, maybe 3, 4, 5 years consecutively, playing the Warriors or playing whoever else that they're playing against. But that, to me, is what I worry about now more than ever with the Chicago Bulls, is you wait too long and you set yourself back. And it's not that it's Lonzo Ball's fault, but at the same time, to your point, Shaw, business is business.
Yes, sir. It's a terrible year for the Ball brothers, ironically, as well.
Yeah, LaMelo Ball going down as well, too. Yeah.
So,
all right, Shaw, finally, let's talk about you're not one to really have these kind of conversations. That's the reason why I'm interested why you put this one on the docket. But obviously, this has gained a lot of attention. The Dillon Brooks, Draymond Green, quote unquote, clash.
this is for you. This is a Game Face League special.
Why would this be for me?
Because you love vitriol. You love angst.
I don't know if I necessarily. Well, I don't know if I don't particularly care for this one, to be honest with you.
But then we don't need to spend a whole lot of time on
it. Yeah. So obviously, Dillon Brooks. Well, here's my thing. I'll give it to Dillon Brooks. He is consistent. He is consistent in the way that he just talks. Okay, like there ain't no filter to this kid, right? I think just not too long ago, he just started talking about how he wants to get at Kyrie Irving. All right. That's just like,
something like they didn't want to come back against a hard team or something. Like, yeah, he's a wild dude, man.
Yeah, man. I mean, listen, have at it, bro. I think anybody who thinks that this is all for, for the likes, for the memes, y'all are sadly mistaken. I think this is how Dillon Brooks is wired. You know what I'm saying? And there's only a few people out there who love the opportunity of going at, dudes who act like that. And so, of course, it's why we're in this sense that, we're watching with our popcorn this whole thing between Dillon Brooks and Draymond Green. So, but I want to pose an interesting question to you, Shaw, because somebody had discussed. I was watching ESPN and they had this conversation real quick about do you consider the Grizzlies and the Warriors a rivalry?
It's not a rivalry. They have legitimate beef. And I know there's going to be maybe a distinction between that, so to speak. But, to coin the phrase that you always mention to, and I think everybody understands the Grizzlies have not done anything. So they're not a true threat to the Golden State, in essence, for it to be a rivalry.
Before you finish your thought, Shaw, I'm glad you brought this up, because it was interesting how Brian Windhorst utilized the fact that the Memphis Grizzlies knocked out the Golden State Warriors in the play-in game and use that as a mechanism to validate this quote-unquote rivalry that is taking place between the Grizzlies and the Warriors. And I found it interesting because he almost had me thinking, well, and then I'm glad you kind of brought me back down to earth. Okay.
Nah, I mean, you were able to kick the Warriors when they were down. It was now 3 years ago. They've gone on and won a championship since that. So, so I think it's disingenuous at best to call it a rivalry. But there's nothing like a good old fashioned beef, and
thank you. There's rivalry and there's beef,
and so where they land is in that lens, and it may stem all from Dillon Brooks and his dislike of Draymond, and Draymond wanting to feed into that and feeling like he can get into the head of a young team that hasn't done anything yet. The way that he laid stuff out against Brooks was, it was downright insulting. You know what I mean? I thought I clutched my non-existing pearls for Dillon Brooks. I said, yo, Draymond is reading the riot act here. But at the same time, in that game, the Memphis Grizzlies got the not even said the last laugh, the intermediate laugh, and then they'll play again, one more time in Memphis before the season is concluded, and then we'll see what ends up happening playoff wise. There's a slim possibility, not slim, but there's a realistic possibility that it could be a first round matchup. You could have Memphis Grizzlies and Golden State in 3-6, or maybe even 2-7. Like it could happen in the first round. And I don't think that's the smoke that the Grizzlies want, but they'll tell you that they're running up the chimney, all of that. And good for them. At the end of the day, I think it's a lot of fun for the NBA. It gives us something to continue to talk about, where these two guys and these two teams now genuinely do not like each other. And it's up to Memphis to make it a rivalry by actually proving something and doing it against them in the playoffs.
Right. So you highlighted so many really good points about this. And so this is where I completely agree with you when I say, yeah, they got beef. They genuinely have beef with each other. There are guys who genuinely just don't like the other guys on that roster, on that team, for whatever their reasons are. And I think in some cases, they've all laid that out in some way, shape, or form. So we understand that. But at no point, except for last year, right, did we see where the Warriors and the Grizzlies were playing for something significant. Now, the play-in, yes. But remember, the Warriors didn't have Klay Thompson. The Warriors barely had Draymond Green. The Warriors were not a good basketball team. They just won enough games to take advantage of what the play-in reflected, okay? Our expectation was that the Memphis Grizzlies were supposed to go in there and likely beat the Golden State Warriors. You know what I'm saying? Except most people predicted it because they played at Golden State, okay? So, yeah, that could start something. But unless the Memphis Grizzlies made a significant run that year, there was nothing from that except two teams who basically needed to get themselves into the playoffs. One knocked the other team out. I think where this all started was the Memphis Grizzlies talking as if the Golden State Warriors were yesterday's news, were has-beens, and then the Warriors proceed to go on and they win a championship at the expense of the Memphis Grizzlies. And the Memphis Grizzlies can say whatever they want to say about it, but you would wish that you weren't the team to have to deal with the Golden State Warriors, because it validates exactly what they were trying to say. Don't disrespect us. Put some respect on our name. So I think that's the reason why it's just interesting that the guys that are talking the most are the guys that really genuinely hate the other dude that they're talking about, as if to say, we as people who are looking from the outside in are validating some level of a rivalry here. There is no level of a rivalry until we see these guys playing in a significant situation like last year. Now, if the Memphis Grizzlies turn around and knock out the Warriors when they're cemented in the playoffs, now we're talking a rivalry. But if the Warriors come back and do the same thing that they did to the Memphis Grizzlies last year, this is still not a rivalry, because the Memphis Grizzlies have not done what is required to equate what rivalries normally do. All they have is just genuine beef.
Yeah, well said, well said. And I'll say for Memphis, I think they could lose the series and then start to make, like, it needs to be contentious, like 7 games and, that type of situation, but if you get beaten 5, even 6, I think there just needs to be a point of like, yeah, you really had a chance to beat this team. And I don't believe that Memphis was really all that close last year, unfortunately for them. But we'll see if they're going to be closer this year, especially if those two match up again. But yeah, the beef is fun.
Beef is fun. And I say that with all sincerity, even to my vegetarians out there. This kind of beef is fun. You're tuned to The Baseline. Callie Warren Shaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. Coming up, we start talking play-in predictions. My man Shaw got us in our fields, man, about who them 4 teams are gonna lock it up and enter themselves into the conversation about trying to be in that playoff chase, man. We'll talk about them from the East and the West here on The Baseline. Time to break it down. To the bone gristle. Time now for the breakdown. Callie Warren Shaw, Baseline NBA podcast, and our topic for the breakdown, talk about that play-in. So Shaw decided to whip out the crystal ball. Caldini has to come out. I thought he was going to be on a hiatus this year, but that's okay. And we got to talk about the East and West play-in situation, right? So we'll focus our attention on the East, Shaw, because we did a good amount of time talking about some Western Conference basketball early. So let's never neglect our Eastern brothers where necessary. And there's a few teams, man, that really want to position themselves to be involved in the play-in. You basically have I want to say you have almost a 6-team race, so to speak. And the reason why I'm throwing the Atlanta Hawks in there is if the Atlanta Hawks don't be careful, they could be playing themselves out of this situation, right? Even with getting Quinn Snyder in. They sit at 34-34, and they're currently in the 8th seed. But because they're striking distance by, with the Indiana Pacers right now currently at the 12th seed, is this basically about 2.5 games with a handful of games left. We have seen the Atlanta Hawks look like that they could be a team that can make a move, but then we've also seen that this Atlanta Hawks team is capable of taking steps back. And so I find it very interesting, Shaw, that when you look at how things are stacked down at the bottom of the Eastern Conference, there is really very little wiggle room for teams to go on losing streaks and not think that it could set themselves in a position where they're going to be chasing the rest of the other teams that they're trying to get into the play-in.
It's a wild situation. There's so many teams out there. So we'll just run them down. I think Miami is going to be in the play-in tournament. I don't think they're going to do enough to catch New York or Brooklyn. You keep waiting for Brooklyn to kind of really fall back to the pack, but they basically have been maintaining 500 basketball, and I think that'll be enough for them in essence because of the padding and cushion Kyrie and KD gave them to remain above the play-in line. I firmly believe that unless Miami wins out, so to speak, right? So Miami, Atlanta, Toronto, Chicago, Washington, Indiana, all those teams are in the play-in conversation one way or another. Miami is clearly the best team, and maybe that's strong terminology. My hunch tells me they're the best team of that group and should have the best yield against most of those teams. But if they end up in a 7-8, so to speak, with Toronto is a tough basketball team. They started to skid again, unfortunately, but I still think because of their length, they're going to be really problematic. So all those teams to me, again, And the Pacers were sitting in the middle of the conference at one point in the course of this year. Then they just went on a terrible losing streak. To me, they're the team playing in some ways kind of the worst basketball at the wrong time, but they're still very, very, very viable. And Chicago, despite everything we said about them, continues to have a dog in the fight. Zach LaVine has been on a scoring binge. I think maybe only Damian Lillard and a few others have been better than him since the turn of the year, I think, offensively. That's why I think this Eastern Conference race is extremely, extremely, extremely close. And I know you love to kick down on the Hawks a little bit, but they are one of the stronger teams, I think, when it comes to having an opportunity to get in here too. So I wanted to ask you from your standpoint, can you count anybody out? Is there anybody that you're like, listen, I don't care what the record says, they're not going to be in this to win it kind of down the stretch here? And I'd say that probably leads you to Chicago, Washington, and Indiana, but they're still only a game away from Toronto.
So I would have said to you maybe the Toronto Raptors, because they have the third toughest schedule remaining, in not just the conference, but in the NBA. I will say, though, that part of my concern is that there's not enough games where the Toronto Raptors can control their own destiny, so to speak, against the other teams that they're playing to knock out, right? Like, for example, the Toronto Raptors have 2 games that they still have to play against the Bucks and the Celtics. Then they've got games against the Sixers, the Heat, and the Minnesota Timberwolves, right? They're not chasing those teams. So if you're the Toronto Raptors, you wish that you had more games playing against the Pacers. You only play 1 game against the Pacers. And then they got games against the Pistons, the Hornets, and OKC. If they take care of business, they should probably position themselves well to at least have home field advantage for the play-in. My concern, though, is when you talk about play-in situations and you look at who you're playing against, I would rather be playing against those teams where you have the opportunity to knock them out, rather than playing against teams who have already supplanted themselves, who've usurped you, or really don't have any teeth in the game, so to speak, but can still do damage to your ability to get into the play-in situation. Now, the Indiana Pacers, they have the 10th toughest schedule, right? And so, I'm a little leery about what's going on with Indiana, right? Because they don't have as many easier opponents remaining on their schedule for them to play, with the only team they're playing against being the Toronto Raptors. So it's kind of interesting, Shaw, how this can easily play itself out. If you're the Atlanta Hawks and you take care of your business, you probably will survive, right? But again, they have the 19th hardest schedule. And so you go down the line, and I'm telling you, the one that scares me the most, really, Shaw, is the Indiana Pacers, because they've got a very hefty schedule remaining against the better teams in the NBA of their schedule. And the only one team that they're playing against that is going to be an obstacle in their ability to maintain play-in chase potential.
All right. So I'm gonna agree with you there. I think I just don't like the cut of their jib, if you will, with the Pacers and how things are potentially looking for them.
Mm-hmm.
Halliburton has been banged up, so he's missing games here and there, and they cannot do it without him. Like, they just absolutely cannot. So he would need to be available for every single remaining one of their games and playing at a high level. Despite Toronto having one of the hardest schedules remaining, I just think they're somewhat veteran laden. Nick Nurse is a guy who's going to be getting and scheming against some of these teams, and they play Boston well. So I don't necessarily think like that's a problem for them. Is obviously they'd rather see a lesser team on the schedule, I'm sure, but yeah, you just don't kind of know where it is. And what we have here now is like, we're not looking at like maybe the totality of when they play these teams. If it's in the last week of the season,
I'm sure that, yes, that will definitely play a factor. Yes.
Yeah, might be decided. So for me, I'm gonna rule out the Pacers. And then I'm really just kind of stuck between Washington and Chicago. Porzingis is playing the best basketball of his NBA career, like really and truly.
Oh my goodness, really? Yeah.
Porzingis, yeah, he's been hooping, and for the most part, been healthier than he's been in a long time. So what he's doing defensively for them, and the way he's been able to find a yield and playing off Bradley Beal at times. Kuzma's regressed maybe a little bit here in the latter part of this as the season kind of closes down. But I think it is going to land where exactly it is right now, where Toronto and Chicago make it in as 9 and 10, whatever order that ultimately ends up looking like. And I think Miami, as I alluded to, is very safe. And I think Atlanta, same thing, with Quinn Snyder there now, they're going to figure some things out. So I'm going to go ahead and rule out Washington and Indiana, and then see where I'll give you my prediction here. I think it actually is going to be Miami, and I'm going to go with the Raptors, who get in with the Hawks missing the playoffs in whatever ends up happening. And I think so right now it'd be Miami and Atlanta in the 7-8. And then I'd say Atlanta ends up having home court against the Raptors, but I think the Raptors squeak it out, and the Heat and Raptors end up being your 7 and 8 seeds.
I kind of like the Miami Heat holding on. I don't know what it is. I just feel like there's still a switch that Eric Spoelstra can find in these guys for them to sustain, where they are. And if obviously they maintain, playing as the 7 seed, I think that they will move forward and be involved in the playoffs. I think the greater concern to me is going to wind up being, is there enough opportunity or games for us to feel confident about what's going to happen between Atlanta, Toronto, and I think it's interesting. I think it's going to be the Washington Wizards that I think wind up getting in there, and then I would not put it past the idea that even though the Atlanta Hawks really should be the team that moves forward, I like the Washington Wizards. I really think it comes down to who plays who. If the Toronto Raptors play the Washington Wizards, I like the Toronto Raptors. If the Atlanta Hawks play like the Washington Wizards, I like I like Atlanta a little bit. But I just to your point, I think Washington is a very dangerous team. Gafford's been playing very well. I just think as a team holistically, they could ride on a wave of momentum that I don't think people, can speak to. So, it's interesting. I'm just more confident, I guess, about the Miami Heat. I just think too much veteran laden play, and I think execution on their part to go in and do what's necessary to get themselves in. The teams that are outliers for me are going to always be Atlanta, Toronto, and Washington. But I think at the end of the day, I think the two teams that will probably put themselves in position to be playing, it's going to wind up being the Heat and the Toronto Raptors.
That makes some sense, and I think even I'm as you're talking, I'm even reassessing it a little bit too. I actually don't like Toronto versus Chicago as much as I thought I did. Even just a couple of things sets ago, I've thought about what I've seen and how they've played, so to speak. Toronto Washington is a better matchup for Toronto than Toronto Chicago. So if Washington does get in, that gives my earlier prediction a little bit more viability, I think, for Toronto to probably get through. But if Toronto ends up playing Chicago as currently constructed in that 9-10, then I'm not as excited, because I think, again, the explosiveness of Levine and even DeRozan to some degree can pose a problem, I think, for Toronto, where they do struggle sometimes offensively. So this is what makes it so much fun, because we could all be wrong. The Pacers could come here and mash everything up. You know what I mean? The Hawks could figure out a way to get hot, send the Heat, into the true playing game. If they beat them in the 7-8 matchup. And then, Miami and Toronto don't really match up all that well, I think, from Miami's standpoint. They've had some success in Chicago, but Chicago's beaten them this year as well. So again, it's just it's crazy. It's crazy, and that's what makes it so much fun. So I'd love to hear our fans' thoughts and predictions on the Eastern Conference, but we'll get to the West here in a little bit.
Let me ask you a question real quick, Shaw. For the Chicago Bulls, you've pretty much have already played this season without having, Lonzo Ball, right? Do you see any room in there where they can finish this thing out and be a relevantly tough out for whoever they play against? Or do you just
there's some metrics out there. When I say some metrics out there, I mean it's defensive metrics and NBA standings, if you will. The Bulls have been one of the better defensive teams, since since Pat Beverly has been there. And I think they're starting to even rely somewhat on that and trying to find a defensive identity, even with the scoring prowess of Levine and DeRozan to a lesser extent. So to me, they're more viable than I thought they were. And coming into this, because they've tried to figure out a way that, listen, all right, well, how can we win basketball game? all right, let's try to lock in. Now, some people think it's just fool's gold and it's just it is whatever. It's a glitch in the matrix. If there's any viability and truth to what they've been doing here in the last couple of weeks defensively, then then they have a real chance to come in here and be disruptors in the bottom half of this Eastern Conference.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. You're tuned to The Baseline. Callie, Warren Shaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. My man Shaw dropping down the science as we are giving you our play-in predictions. Coming up, we're going to switch over to the Western side where it is a mess in the West. So we're going to do our best to try to sort through that here on The Baseline. We are back, Callie, Warren Shaw, Baseline NBA podcast, and we are doing our subject of the breakdown where we are giving you our play-in predictions, and we just finished discussing the Eastern Conference, laying it out. So now let's go ahead and switch our attention over to the West, Shaw. And like I said, before we jumped into our break, man, it's a mess in the West, right? Like you've literally got 13 teams, I'm sorry, not 13, but you literally have like 7 teams almost, right, that have an opportunity to find themselves in a play-in situation, which is just it's absurd. But that's the realism of what we're dealing with. And I mean, you can count the Portland Trailblazers, Oklahoma City Thunder, New Orleans Pelicans, Utah Jazz, LA Lakers, Dallas Mavericks, Minnesota Timberwolves, and the Golden State Warriors. And if you want to go high up the food chain, Shaw, you may even want to throw in the Los Angeles Clippers in there as well too, man. So, I mean, it is a rat race. Everyone trying to get out of it, but let's try to keep things within the scope of play-in, certainty here. When you look at the teams that are currently situated where they are, is it realistic that the status quo stays? Or when you look at how everything is laid out, who do you find to be most viable to be in play-in situation and to be coming out of it?
So I can make this conversation somewhat short. I think the Lakers have found a groove. Somehow they've been able to figure it out with their some of their new parts, and I think they're going to be in this play-in conversation. And I think Minnesota is going to be in the play-in conversation, and I think Dallas as well too, by virtue of Luka and Kyrie, assuming they're both healthy. To me, it's the 10 spot that I'm like, all right, I have no idea what the hell's happening here. Utah, New Orleans, OKC, and Portland all still very, very much in there. And again, I understand they're Lakers like a game up on all of these teams here as we record. So yeah, I just feel like they're gonna solidify it. So for me, that's where the conversation kind of starts and end though. But it's statistically that's not where it is at all. So forgive me if you're a fan of listener here, like okay, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. But New Orleans, OKC, Portland, and Utah. Utah has the toughest remaining schedule of any team out there in the NBA. And you just figure, especially with them now battling some injuries as well, too. Clarkson's been out. Colin Sexton's been out as well. So Taylor Horton Tucker is running the point guard position. They've signed Chris Dunn to multiple 10 days. I think that's going to catch up with them. And despite the miraculous season that Markkanen has had, the emergence of Walker Kessler, as a defensive stalwart at the center position, I think their luck is probably going to run out. That leads me now to New Orleans, OKC, and Portland. You have the veteran leadership and just scoring prowess of Damian Lillard, and getting Anthony Simons back into the fold now here too. Nurkic is back. Do they have enough juice in essence to kind of to make a run here to get into the play-in? And then OKC and New Orleans. New Orleans still battling without Zion Williams. CJ doing the best he possibly can to keep that team afloat, with Ingram also now battling injuries. OKC almost despite themselves. SGA has also been battling injuries here down the stretch. I say all that to say that I probably am going to lead towards the veteran and the guy who's been there the most and done it more than any of the guys that we spoke about here. I think Lillard gets this Blazers team into the 10 seed, and then into some semblance of a battle with either Dallas or LA, or I guess even Minnesota is still in that conversation. But to me, that's where the 7, 8, 9 is going to be. 7, 8, 9, 10 is going to be. It's going to be Minnesota, Dallas, LA, and I think the Blazers.
I love where you're going with this. I agree with you when it comes to the Utah Jazz. I just think that they just don't have enough games for them to really kind of determine their own fate about what's going to take place, even though it's interesting because they do play 2 games against the Los Angeles Lakers. I think it'd be interesting when they play the Lakers and where each of those teams are respectively, if the Utah Jazz would affect more about the Los Angeles Lakers than the Lakers affecting the Utah Jazz. But I just think overall, there's just way too many top-ended teams that the Utah Jazz are going to have to, figure out ways to win. That is giving me any level of confidence that they can supplant themselves in that play-in situation. So that leads me to the Portland Trailblazers and the New Orleans Pelicans. Albeit, though, let me throw this caveat in that the Oklahoma City Thunder have a very nice schedule that they can just F things up completely. And so while it's easy for us to lean on the fact that the Portland Trailblazers over the years, with Dame, as long as you've got Dame time, they have always found a way to make headway, to insert themselves in situations they have no business being a part of. And so I can see where you're feeling more confident about seeing the Portland Trailblazers take that final spot. But I got to be honest with you, Shaw, and I hate doing this because I you know me, man. I've just always been iffy about these New Orleans Pelicans. And it's interesting because you have been very high on the Pelicans in previous years. And if this roster figures out a way to stay healthy enough and be competitive enough, there should be no reason why they don't find themselves taking that final spot. And I just feel like with Brandon Ingram and McCollum and everybody and Willie Green, they did it last year. They fought to figure out a way to get themselves in this position to be relevant and to be playing. I think they're going to do it again. And I don't know what it is about this team. It's like this, like you watch those movies and you have that villain who just really gets tired of the hero just not damn well dying, is just frustrated. Why don't you just damn well die, damn it? That's where I feel like with the New Orleans Pelicans, because I really feel like if they were going to be this good, they should be good enough to be top 6. But they're not that good, and so we just want them to just fall out so that we can be realistic about what we want to talk about for them next year. But somehow they're still good enough that they can just find themselves being in the play-in. And I think that's what's going to happen with them. So I feel like it's going to be the Pelicans taking that final seed, albeit I can see why the Portland Trailblazers, Shaw, you would be more confident in seeing them take that final spot simply because they have proven it time and time again.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny. So again, we're in agreement, I guess, that the Lakers are going to somehow get themselves in here almost unceremoniously to some degree. Let me tell you, my heart is actually with OKC. I'd love to see SGA get.
All right, you want to see that? Like, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, just to get and Giddy, like them, just to get the play in, even if it's not the playoff, but the play in experience, just that they can build on next year. I'm really rooting for them. And with New Orleans, it's just that because without Zion, or whatever is going to ultimately happen, I feel like they probably should just rule him out for the remainder of the year. It doesn't look like he's really on going to have the ability to kind of come back.
Right.
My heart would have been there as well too, and I would obviously be rooting against the Lakers in all capacity. So but I think realistically speaking, we're going to get kind of old hat, and I feel like we're going to get the Lakers and Portland to finish out the 9 and 10. But I'd love to see it be OKC. And even Utah to a lesser degree, or New Orleans if the Zion were to be able to kind of come back to kind of finish there too. So to close the loop, I think there's, like I said, I think the Warriors finished above the play-in line, some semblance of 7 and 8. So I guess I'm gonna go with the Dallas probably catch. Dallas ends up at 7. I think the Lakers are going to actually end up at 8 with Minnesota being in the 9 and 10 situation. So by virtue of that, I think we're going to get. I think we're going to get Dallas and the Lakers here as the 7 and 8 seeds, ultimately when said and done, even after the play-in is done.
That's going to be an interesting matchup, Shaw. Well, let me ask you this, though. If you were to see a situation where it's, say, the Lakers and the Blazers, do you think this time around, even with as talent-laden, so to speak, as the Lakers have with LeBron and with AD, that you still feel more confident that if Damian Lillard turns up like he's capable of turning up, that might not even be able to help the Lakers get out of that play-in situation?
So if I get what you're asking, well, the way I'm predicting it, I don't think the Lakers and Blazers are going to meet.
They're going to
One
meet.
way or the other.
I'm trying to figure out a way to see the Lakers and the Blazers meet if that were to be the case, right? Because
Yeah.
I'm saying that it's going to be the Pelicans more than it's going to be the Blazers. But what I'm just saying is that if we did see a situation where the Lakers do play the Blazers, right? How confident are you that it's just an automatic run through like the Lakers did a few years ago on the Blazers, or do we see
I'd tell you to look no further than our friends, on the 19 Media Network. Look at Late Night Lake Show and Ricky Barnes and Omar and those guys. Kwame, they do an amazing job. They don't ever want to see Dame come down to a real, like, they know what that is, like, because he has the potential to be the best player in that game on any given game, even with AD being peak AD, and you just still never know with that too. So I'd be very nervous if I was a Laker fan and somehow my season came down to whether or not I need to go and oust Damian Lillard. I think any team is like, hey, that's a tough proposition. While I don't think Portland is equipped to make a real playoff run here, in a one-game situation scenario, that's just problematic. So you got to make sure that you game plan it and make sure that you can limit Dame, because he has the ability to cook you for 50, 60, even 70, as we've seen this season.
Right. And I noticed that you had said that, you're likely going to see the Lakers take on the Dallas Mavericks, say, as that play-in situation.
Yeah.
How confident are you about the Dallas Mavericks kind of getting it together to usurp the Minnesota Timberwolves?
I mean, they're tied right now as we record, so I think it's a tiebreaker that has it the way it is. I'm worried about Minnesota only because there's rumors that Cat ultimately is close to coming back, but still don't know what the timeline is. And I think bringing him back into the fold obviously should be a good thing, but I still think like the season has gone too off the tread without him, that I just don't know how they're going. I think they're going to struggle to try to bring him back into the fold somewhat. And while I like what Conley's been able to do to kind of unlock Gobert in the short term, I think when you throw Cat back into that equation, I think they're going to complicate some things for the Timberwolves, where they're going to probably fall out. So for me, Dallas, it's all about health, and all bets are off. If Kyrie and Luka are not healthy, then we're not even talking about anything right now. Like, they're going to get rocked out. But
I think we would have a very good show or segment where we play head coach, like, what would you do situation with certain teams. Because if I'm Chris Finch, I would be very interested in seeing what Cat would look like coming off the bench or handling the second unit, right? Like, I really think that they have something there. It's not consistent, but it's there, and it's doable because they've had to use it in having Reed on the floor, utilizing Gobert. You've got Conley, you've got Edwards. You know who your go-to guy is, even if you bring back Cat. I think the question is does Cat help everything flow properly? And I think that if you want to instill confidence in Cat's ability to redeem himself for how he played in last year's run in the playoffs, I think this might be a great opportunity to kind of, under the radar, put him in that situation where he is playing, is the main guy for that second unit and building from there. And then as if you get out of that first round or that play-in situation and he looks like he is in rare form, in pure form, where he can make a significant contribution, then you can reinsert him back into the situation. But it'd be interesting, Shaw, because if I'm the Minnesota Timberwolves, I got to be really careful about what I'm showing people as far as the level of competitiveness that this team is exhibiting. I think getting rid of Russell was a good situation for them because I just think how he plays with the way that team is constructed is holding the team back. And so clearly you could see how significant an uptick in play for the Lakers is benefited bringing back Russell, but then how better the Minnesota Timberwolves looks having Conley, right? So it's just interesting because all of this is going to play a factor into what you're saying is the likelihood of who's going to be that first play-in matchup if the Minnesota Timberwolves wind up coming down a notch and the Lakers then wind up having to take on the Dallas Mavericks.
Yeah. Well, Minnesota, it's still going to be just about, in some ways, what is Gobert playable, in playoffs, so I think whether you bring Cat off the bench in whatever capacity, it's like who's going to be closing games is really what's going to be the most important for them too.
Yeah,
so and if Gobert's not playable, then that doesn't really mean much, I think, for the impact of what Cat is supposed to be bringing for them if he can come back and be, even 80-90% of what he was supposed to be this year. But I think in the short term, in the regular season, that's where they're going to have some we're going to have some real problems trying to figure out, okay, what is our identity if and when he comes back, and assuming that he'll be back here in let's say the last 5 to 7 games of the season. So a lot to discuss here in the West. And, as always, hope our fans listeners enjoy this conversation, because, we're feeling our way in the dark here through it, because there's, again, you still don't really know. So we're just throwing out some predictions, but it all can be blown up, by a team's uncertain desire, if you will, to kind of say, you know what, F that. It's our time now. Damn what anybody else is saying, and damn what our strength of schedule is saying as well, too.
There you go. Here you go. For the baseline, Kylie, Warren Shaw, we appreciate you guys as always. Thanks for hopping on board with us this week. Be sure to catch us next week. We got the goods, baby, and we love presenting it to you here. Kylie, Warren Shaw, we appreciate you guys. We do. We'll catch up with you next time.